Welcome, everybody. All you chatty, happy people. Welcome, everyone. This is the second lecture in our Indigenous Science Green College series. First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In the context of this Green College series, this land acknowledgement is not just a formality, not that it should ever be just a formality, but it's in fact the impetus for this series as a whole. So I want to take a moment to consider what's at stake in each element of this declaration. Traditional, of course, marks the fact that these lands have long been the home territory of the Musqueam people. We settlers, or that is those of us who are settlers, are uninvited guests. The Musqueam are our hosts at UBC, and we're reminded of this by Edgar Heapabird's Native Hosts installation on the UBC campus, those signs that you read partly backwards saying, UBC, your host today is. And also, it's very well worth taking a look at Jordan Abel's evocation. It's a poem and with beautiful visual accompaniment. About this, or inspired by Native hosts, his evocation of the whole land we're on. And among other, the sort of refrain that runs through this piece that's online, today your hosts are the people. Today your host is the nation, the unceded, resurgence. And especially salient for us here today, today your host is the thinking and wondering Indigenous knowledge. Ancestral recognizes that this land has been hounded down from generation to generation according to Indigenous traditions that safeguard its health and that of all that's connected to it. Unceded, of course, means that these lands were never turned over to the Crown by treaty or any other agreement. The motivation for this series as a whole and the research cluster that inspired it is to take up the calls to action set out in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report of 2015 to find ways in the context of our practice as educators and scholars, to move beyond the acknowledgement of historical and ongoing injustice in the treatment of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, to find ways as a collective of UBC-based researchers to advance the goals of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, actionable justice, by building equitable, respectful, and transparent partnerships with Indigenous communities. Our expertise, the cluster that inspired this series, lies chiefly in archaeology, geochemistry, material science, science studies. So the projects that we're taking up focus mainly on questions about Indigenous histories and land use as defined by Indigenous partners. Just over a year ago, we learned about an eminence research cluster. UBC Okanagan's clusters are called eminence clusters. We just have research clusters. They have eminence. And this one in particular is committed to collaborative practice in the domain of ecology. The title, Enhancing Ecosystem Sustainability, Contributing to Reconciliation through the co-production of ecological knowledge from both Western and Syilx perspectives. So we're honored to have the two cluster leads with us here tonight, Jeannette Armstrong and Lael Parrott. As a Syilx Okanagan elder and traditional knowledge keeper, Jeannette Armstrong is an internationally renowned, I'm sure I don't have to explain this to any of you, but anyway, here it is. Renowned author, an incredibly powerful speaker, an activist who's been recognized for her advocacy of Indigenous environmental ethics and practice by a number of major awards. EcoTrust Buffett Award for Indigenous Leadership in 2003, and a BC George Woodcock Lifetime Achievement Award in 2016. She helped found the Okanagan School of International Writing. She's playing a central role, I understand, in establishing a First Nation language fluency degree, setting out its guiding principles in a 2011 discussion paper, now articulated in a formal proposal for Indigenous language proficiency framework for BC. I believe under review, and I hope with great success. I hope it moves smoothly through. Jeannette holds a Canada Research Chair at UBC-Okanagan in Okanagan Indigenous Knowledge and Philosophy. Lael Parrott has a long-standing commitment to research and advocacy for what she describes as a holistic, complex systems vision of managing land and water resources at the landscape scale. She's also internationally recognized scholar in this case for her work modeling complex human environmental ecosystems. She's done a great deal of innovative work with community groups, planners, ecological scientists, aimed at finding sustainable solutions to wicked environmental problems that balance social, economic, and ecological concerns. The wicked problems figures in a title of a 2017 paper, the subtitle of which is Guidance for Stakeholder Involvement and Collaborative Model Development. Lael is Professor of Sustainability at UBC Okanagan in the Departments of Earth, Environmental, and Geographical Sciences and Biology, and she's the Director of the Okanagan Institute for Biodiversity, Resilience, and Ecosystem Services. So a warm welcome to both, and I believe you're going to be inviting engagement as you go, and there'll be lots of chance for discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you to everyone in the room for being here. This is wonderful to see you. Myself and Jeannette are, as Allison said, co-leading a research cluster that has received internal funding from UBC. And I'd also like to acknowledge our colleague, Mike Evans, who was really integral in bringing us together and establishing the cluster. And he's on leave right now, otherwise he'd probably be here this evening as well. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what the cluster is, what our objectives are, and Jeannette's going to speak a little bit more from her perspectives. And our idea for this evening was just to each speak a little bit to introduce what we're working on and then engage you in a conversation about working, how do we work better at merging our Western science, the university-based approaches with Indigenous ways of knowing, and how do we perhaps work together and move forward towards reconciliation and towards building a more sustainable and just society. And so what we're talking about tonight is a partnership, and is a partnership between UBC Okanagan and the Okanagan Nation Alliance that really began with UBC establishing a campus in the Okanagan Valley and has grown since then, and much of that thanks to the presence of Jeannette in our faculty. But this particular eminence-funded cluster, officially, we received funding about a year ago from UBC, and the process of developing the idea to go forward with this proposal started before then. But our proposal had really two basic goals, and one is to look at co-constructing new and innovative, transformative methods in ecosystem management and conservation that really respond to the key concerns of the Syilx communities and which address some of the key ecological concerns that we're all seeing on the Okanagan traditional territory. And our other key goal is one that's more reflective in terms of looking at how can we co-construct better ways of working together. So we had both a science and environmental kind of goal, as well as a process-based goal of how can we also advance the ways of working together. Our cluster involves a wide range of disciplines, different people committed to working towards these two goals. And so I put their names up there, but also their general areas of expertise, so you can see the diversity of people involved in our group, because it really ranges from chemistry to fine arts and everything in between. And each person has a unique nugget of knowledge and skills that they contribute to this cluster. We've also recently recruited a cohort, our first cohort of 9 students, ranging from undergraduate to postdoctoral, and 5 of those 9 students are Indigenous. So the process really began with a higher level memorandum of understanding to work together that was really negotiated between the leaders of our institutions. And that then worked down to a number of different meetings in preparation for even preparing this proposal to work together, where we brought researchers into the room and Syilx leaders and knowledge holders, and started the process of relationship building and talking about, do we want to work together, and if so, how are we going to work together, and what are our shared and common goals? And I'm going to let Jeannette speak more to the process that we've been through in terms of sharing, because she has a number of slides talking about that. So I'm going to gloss over it, but just say over the past couple of years, a lot of what we've been doing is sharing and relationship building. And we've come to a point now where we have some ideas about projects that are starting. They're concrete projects with students assigned to them, and we're starting to actually move forwards towards the different goals that we've established. And the three areas that we've really decided are the areas of focus. These are key concerns that came to us from the community and from the chiefs, are first of all looking at grizzly bear and habitat restoration for the grizzly in the whole Okanagan territory, particularly with regards to their relationship with the huckleberry. And the huckleberry is a key food source for the grizzly bear, and a number of things are affecting both grizzly and huckleberry. Forest management and the extensive forest harvesting that's occurred across the landscape and fragmentation of those habitats. They've changed the abundances and distributions of food sources for the bears and also affected their use of the landscape. And more recently, we're seeing an unregulated commercial harvest of huckleberry on our public lands. And nobody really knows how much huckleberry is being harvested. A lot of the people out on the land are seeing this occurring and have a good idea of where it's happening and how much, but that's not documented by the province. And so there are considerable concerns about the potential impact of that on the grizzly bears and their ability to have food and to use their habitats. And so that's one area of focus that really came to us from the community. It was expressed to us by many community members as being of concern. And the other one is related to salmon and returning salmon to our rivers, and particularly through restoration of the salmon spawning grounds and restoration of riparian vegetation, which is so critical to maintaining the quality of those spawning grounds. And particularly in the lower elevation valley bottoms in the Okanagan Valley, we've seen significant loss of the riparian cottonwood natural native vegetation that would have been there to protect the salmon-bearing streams. And so salmon is that other area of focus, and of course salmon and grizzly are intricately connected as well. And then the last really important one is engagement of Syilx youth, both at the university level in terms of offering opportunities for training and for higher level education, but also working with the younger parts of the community and engaging youth and showing them opportunities and getting them excited about some of these issues and integrating them into our work. And so that's another key focus. So just to show you a little bit about the area we're talking about, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Okanagan and with the traditional territory of the Okanagan Nation, it covers a large part of the Columbia River Basin and extends south of the Canadian border into the United States and goes up into the high mountains areas in northeast of Golden. And so that's our area of study, really, an area for which we are really focusing on in terms of what can we do to support ecological restoration and conservation in this whole area. And so those of you who have been to the Okanagan know that it's famous for being Canada's only desert, and that we have very unique semi-arid ecosystems that are really special to Canada and to British Columbia and to the region, and are significantly threatened due to land use transformation for agriculture and for urban development. And so that's probably what many people think of when they think about the Okanagan. But if you look throughout the whole traditional territory, we also have a large part of it which is high mountains and good bear habitat, good caribou habitat, good high mountain ranges. And of course, the problem with these mountains is that they're becoming islands in seas of clear cuts. So this is looking across to the east, across the Kettle Valley, Kettle River Valley towards the Okanagan. So between basically the Okanagan Valley and the Kettle River. And you can see that whole plateau is piecemeal. And much of the interior of British Columbia is fragmented, incredibly fragmented by human activities. And that's having significant impacts on our wildlife. And so these are the kinds of things that are concerning anybody who's out there on the land and seeing them. And all of us who are involved in this eminence project, whether Syilx or Settler, we're all part of it because we care about this landscape and because we want to make a difference. And we're committed to working together and moving forward to coming up with different ways of perhaps managing this landscape, different ways of interacting with it. And our hope is that the outcome of this research over a number of years will lead to some transformation of the way that this landscape looks and the way that it is managed into the future. And so I'm going to pass the mic over to Jeannette.
Switch with you. Do you want to pull up my?
Sure, okay. And we'll just pull this out.
Go, yeah. That's the first slide here.
Okay.
Just so I don't drink your water.
Oh, thank you. And I have to turn this off.
I don't know. I've got my own mic here. So, good evening, and why chashkal khalt? Chashkal khalt itim hula hui maskuyum, itim hula aksul. And just greetings to all of you in my language from the Okanagan Salish people, and greetings and acknowledgement of our cousins, the coastal Salish Musqueam people whose land we're on. And the people that's here tonight, thank you for coming. And I just wanted to thank Allison and Eric for everything they did to get me here and to help us, have this time to be able to talk about a project that we have been working really, really diligently on to try to figure out and figure our way through how to bring these two really sometimes difficult conversations together. Not difficult in terms of people not understanding on each side, but difficult in how to thread it together so that the work together can flourish and can have some impact. I am Syilx. I am from the Penticton part of the Okanagan Territory. So I'm just going to show you some slides, give you some context about the Syilx people and what we generally look at in name only, but maybe a little bit about from the perspective of the landscape that we're from. So when I talk about the Salish people and being cousins with the Musqueam, there we are in the middle of 25 different Salish groups that at one time, 12,000 years ago, was one group that evolved into these 25 different language groups and cultural groups. But the relationships in the interior for the Shuswap, the Okanagan, and those south of the border, the Thompson and the Lillooet, are very close. There hasn't been a lot of years of separation between us and those groups. We also share a big part of the landscape with our neighbors, so part of the Selkirks, part of the Cascades, on both sides of the Okanagan Valley and into the Granby and then over into the Kootenay territory, is really a big part of our territory of use, and the intermixing that we have, the interrelationships that we have with the interior Salish people then Tlakapmuk and the Stlatliumuk and the Shiwapmuk. Those are the traditional names of the Shuswap and the Thompson and the Lillooet. We're very close, as well as across the border with the Wenatchee and the Moses Columbia and the Kalispels and the Spokanes. Those ties are all still very close. And any of our large gatherings in the traditional gathering areas where we gather to celebrate ourselves and our culture and our language and our food and our dances. Some people call them powwows. There's a lot of celebrating going on, and that's at any one of those gatherings you'll see all those tribal people there. That's historical, and that's been ongoing for 12,000 years, I guess. So I wanted to give you another view of the 8 communities of the Okanagan Nation. Although that's the outline of the territory, you can see those little icons there that form the bands, and those have been reduced to just small thousands of acres of land that was designated as reservations, in other words, sanctuaries for us to live in harmony with our land in those little tiny dots. And the rest of the territory is unceded. We use all of that territory every year. We've continued to use it. We still use it. Although we have no jurisdiction and no real power in terms of management, in terms of any ways of mitigating the damages that Lael has described. And so many of the species, not just the ones that we're concentrating and focusing on in this study, but these are 2 large keystone species for us, the largest keystone species for us, meaning that if they're disappearing and they're collapsing, we're in trouble. And so that's one of the reasons the chiefs have identified those areas to concentrate on and focus on, because they cover, they're an umbrella for a lot of other species that fall below that level. This is the construct of the modern Syilx governing organizations. These are the reservations or the reserves, band councils, chiefs and councils. The top one there is the Okanagan Indian Band, the OKIB, the West Bank First Nation, the Penticton Indian Band, the Osuyus Indian Band, and the Colville Confederated District that's down in our territory south of the border, that big invisible border between us and the U.S. Then Lower Snoqualmie Indian Band, and then Upper Snoqualmie Indian Band, and then Upper Nicola Indian Band. And so the 2 nation organizations that are involved in looking at the collective work is the Okanagan Nation Alliance in the middle on the Canadian side, and the Colville Confederated Tribe on the American side. So one of the things about the Okanagan, the Syilx-Okanagan, which now I'm speaking about the Canadian side, the 7 bands in the Canadian part of our territory, they're engaged in a process of asserting what has not been allowed to assert since colonization, since the development of the reserve system and the policies. And so what does that mean, and what has that meant? Well, I know in my lifetime it has meant a lot of struggle. It has meant incarceration for simply going out and picking those huckleberries, for fishing in our rivers and our creeks, for hunting the deer that we have to live on, and the salmon disappearing as a result of all the dams going southward to feed these lights all over Washington State and Idaho and everywhere else, without consultation to our people, without engagement of our people in terms of better management of the species. So one of the things you should know about the Okanagan is that it is in biodiversity, as a result of the diversity of its landscapes, it's one of the hotspots for the diversity of species. It's also, on the negative side, a hotspot for endangered species in Canada. There's only one other spot in Canada. I'm also on the National Committee for the Committee for Endangered Species, the Identification and Status Listing for Endangered Species, and I'm on one of their subcommittees called the Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee that feeds information to all the science committees with all the different species committees. And the situation in the Okanagan is way beyond what most people understand and what people know just by looking at the landscape. And so the highest number of species, and Lael mentioned the cottonwood riparian in the valley floor. As you know, the rivers and the lakes create these meandering areas in where the cottonwoods are part of that system. And that's the place where the municipalities spring up and pave over and agriculture over, and you know, and so it disappears. So in the Okanagan, and it's the key habitat for providing nutrient into the river system for all the salmon and fish species. And it's also, the riparians support 95% of all of the species in the Okanagan, the riparians in the valley floor. And so they're significant, they're very important to the ecosystem and to the collapsing and the restoration of those endangered species. And yet there's only 4% of the cottonwood riparian system left in the whole of the Okanagan. So you can see why, if there's only 4% of that cottonwood riparian left, why there's such a high number of endangered species and extinct species and extirpated species. And so the restoration of that and the assertion of the work to protect and to restore falls on Indigenous people and people who are involved in BRAIS and ecosystem science and the work of the environmental activists to try to school the rest of society about the importance of those things. And of course, on a larger scale, on a macro scale, that's all over the world. That's what's happening. So to try to find a way to create that balance, the assertion of Indigenous people's knowledge and the assertion of collaboration with them for reconciliation, is one of the areas that I think we can think about and use to look at how do we do that. You know, how do we, both as settler and as Indigenous people, create reconciliation in a real way and make that happen, implement that so that real change happens and not just the continued silos that we remain in. The silos being about lack of understanding of how each other works and collaborating around that. So I think for myself, I've spent my life trying to figure out how to do that. And I think this model that we have, I think is one of the models that may open up some doors in that direction. So the idea of the band governments and the Okanagan Nation Alliance in the work that they're doing, one of the important things to understand, and I really appreciated Allison's discussion about and description about unceded territory. What does that mean? It's not just a word that you say. What it means is that this land has not been legally ceded to the Crown the way the Crown dictated. That's what these court cases are about. So the assertion of territory is to say this land is not ceded yet in the proper context of the the legal issues that are necessary. So all of these things that are happening on the land are as a result of illegal works that are not, that are not and should not be accepted by the people of Canada. It's the people of Canada whose laws are doing this. And so the importance of that information and what it means and how it means to write that is reconciliation. The road to reconciliation isn't just going and reading, a plaque about residential schools. That's one tiny bit of it. This is the big part of it. This is the huge part of it. So I really am passionate about this. This is where it will make a difference. This is where it will make a change in your hearts and in our hearts, right? And so that, I think, is really an important message to give in this project that, that we have been working together on. When Lael was talking about the introduction of this idea and the collaboration, the idea from the Syilx point of view is that there are a number of different ways in which we have to engage to create an in-depth and comprehensive dialogue when we're asking about anything. We have to understand and know how the traditions of the people need to be part of that dialogue. What are those traditions? How will they impact and affect any decisions that we make or any things that are going to be outcomes, and how do we reconcile with those? That's the first aspect of reconciliation. And so that's from the Syilx point of view. And so the idea of looking at how to integrate that, the way that we network, the way that we collaborate, the way that we bring together to make something larger and new, right? The way the relationships work, that's what integration is about. How do you relate things and how do things become interdependent? And that's a law in biodiversity, right? And the whole idea of interdependence is what the land has perfected out there. The intelligence of nature out there is built on the idea of how those things figured out how to live on the different places in the conditions that they live in. You can call that adaptation or whatever, but it's always figuring out how that's going to happen. And so that idea of understanding how those integrations can happen without destruction of both, right, is really an important aspect of the way to look at dialogue. How are we going to integrate traditions with these traditions? How are we going to integrate new ideas? So the idea of tradition comes from keeping things that are from the past that have worked. The idea of bringing and integrating anything new has to do with the idea of always change. There's change always going on in the ecosystems that, are caused by fires or new things growing or an overabundance of things. And so change is always part of a healthy system. How is it going to be integrated? So the change of the settlers coming here, that's a huge change. How do we integrate that? How do we look at all of our traditions and create those relationships in a good way? And in particular, how do we reconcile that with the indigenous people here who have reconciled that with their lands and with their neighboring tribal groups and who live in abundance and relative peace and harmony from all the archaeological and all of the ethnographical historical accounts that I have read. So I think it's worthwhile looking at some of these models of how do we do that? How do we dialogue to do that? What are the principles for that? And looking at then how do we apply it? How do we make those applications? What are going to be the outcomes if we do this or if we do that or if we do that? So this model, I think, is really what I call an ecological model in that it's a systems approach in terms of trying to find ways to integrate the whole of the system in the process of the applications that we end up with, or the outcomes that are going to be part of it. And so that's what an Alkanwik is in our language. And we use it as an inquiry model. All of my PhD students and master students that I supervise understand this model and understand it can be utilized for all these different areas of inquiry. Our chiefs understand it in terms of it's necessary to do this. It's necessary to be collaborative and inclusive in this particular way. It's not just a matter of patronizing collaboration and saying, well, we want to hear your opinion, but this is what we're going to do because it's best and we know best, which is usually the way that things happen. And so that model, I think, has real, I think it has a lot of bearing on the idea of providing cultural safety for an Indigenous process with colleagues at, within the research context at university. And in the academic and knowledge-seeking context, I think it's an incredibly important way to understand that Indigenous knowledge has a lot of different components to it that can infuse and really increase the way that we do things in a better way, which leads to reconciliation, which leads to better outcomes for everyone, and which leads to new knowledge. And that's what the academic should be and is for, right? And so that idea of cultural safety can also be used in a lot of different contexts with that model. And so we used that. This is one of our first gatherings that the first part of the bringing together of the Okanagan Nation Alliance and the researchers at UBC-Okanagan was for Mike Evans, and I'm so glad that you mentioned him. Mike helped us to find the dollars to put together a symposium that the chiefs said, we want to know what these scientists do, and we want to be able to know how we can work with them and how they can help what we need. So not the other way around, right? So Indigenous-led research in that context. There's things we need to know and we're asking questions about that we need these scientists for to help us, but we need them to help us in our way. So we want to get to know them. We want to meet them. We want to understand what they're, in general, what they're doing and how that might help us. So that bringing together of people from the chiefs, all the chiefs that were invited, and their technicians that they work with in their communities, from the natural resources and fisheries and whoever they decided they wanted to bring, came together at UBC first of all. And there was a dialogue there, presentations and a dialogue about the desire to create a model like this. And out of that meeting, I went back, and that's my role as Canada Research Chair for Syilx-Okanagan Knowledge. My role was to go back to the chiefs and said, what do you think? What do you want to do? What did you hear? And how would you like to go forward? And so they said, well, we liked what we heard. It was really a good process. And they identified at that point, we would really like to focus on these two really keystone areas. And so could we pull together enough science people that were interested in working with us, collaborating with us as to how we might ask some questions that they want asked and we want asked. So it's not just questions one way, but what are the questions that we can ask that'll help us in the outcomes. And so that's what this Alkanwik session was about. We brought together all the people who were part of the Eminence Cluster proposal. We went through this process to identify what would go into the proposal. So it was prior to the proposal. It wasn't an afterthought, right? So the science people came and said, here's what I think we gave you 3 minutes each to do, to say in a nutshell, in plain language, what they do and what it produces and how it could help. And that was really good because they didn't have a lot of time to use a lot of big fancy words and had to really summarize and make clear for the chiefs and their technicians what it was. And so out of that, there was real excitement because there were breakout sessions and they hammered out ways that we could collaborate and we could put the proposal together. And so that out of that, the people that Lael named as the cluster, we decided to apply for the Eminence Fund to support this collaboration. So part of it from the Syilx side is really dedicated toward recovering for themselves how traditional knowledge works in oral documentation. And that's kind of my specific area of research in looking at how the oral text and the narratives that are part of the oral text and the traditional stories of our people are really not mythology or folk tales or, as they're sometimes described, but they really are a system to document knowledge. And so part of my dissertation covers that, but it comes out of the kind of process that I've witnessed and that I'm a part of, that I have seen, not only in the women, the leadership, and the people that are knowledge keepers in different sectors in our community, and how they prefer to document knowledge about the land, knowledge about species, because over the generations they have had to figure out how to be sustainable. The sustainable use of all the different species on our land is like the top priority for us. And so the ethic of that and the practices around that have continued to be in our knowledge system and have continued to be in our everyday normative practices in the community. Some of that is being eroded and lost as a result of schooling and education in schools that know nothing about that. So the restoration of it is what the third stream is about. We want to be able to not only restore that, but restore it in a way that makes sense in today's world with the modern tools that the beautiful human minds have put together in science, because that is our world as well. So how do we make that happen, and how do we make that happen together? So the idea of that research in terms of the methodologies, that process isn't just a matter of coming together to talk about it, but the active work of the research itself must inform both sides of the teams in terms of learning together and working together, and the outputs being the together, that together we've produced those outputs. So the specificity of things is very difficult because of the way science is compartmentalized into really different areas of expertise. So even this past year, part of it has been trying to work with each scientist on the team to have them figure out what they can contribute to some of the areas of questioning that we have. And for example, huckleberries, right? What is the research question there? So the specificity of just having a couple of people, Indigenous students working with me that are really interested in the plant themselves and working with Dr. Susan Murch, for instance, who's a chemist, plant chemist, to sit down and with those students and put together a whole bunch of ideas about what could be done about the plant nutrients as a result of the change in climate and as a result of pyroclastic events and things like that, and deforestation, what are the changes in the plant chemistry, in the leaves and in the berries themselves, and in the growth patterns and so on, as a result of the soil chemistry changing. So that's a really exciting area for those students. So with my group of women activists, because I do lead a group of women activists that protect the huckleberries, and we're called the Huckleberry Women Protectors. and that's 5 nations. The 5 nations we meet, and then we try to figure out where we can go and protect huckleberries from harvesting or from deforestation, even from our own communities and things like that. And so that group, we take that identification of what the science can be, take it to those knowledgeable women that know every single patch of huckleberries out there, right, Alexa? and so how do you go to them and say, how do you want to engage with the science people in identifying the chemistry of those plants? And so that's like one example. There's examples for the grizzly bear, and collecting of DNA from collecting hair and things like that, coupled with the idea of the knowledge that our hunters have out on the land and the observances that they have. There's a number of different areas like that are really specific in terms of how can the scientists work together with the plan that we have to roll out next summer. So building that relationship is not just outlining and deciding and sending in the proposal and saying this is what we're going to do. So that was an extremely difficult kind of thing for the people accepting the proposal to look at and say, well, okay, what are you going to do, right? And so the development of the idea is embedded in the process, and the development of the specific areas embedded in the process as a part of the consensus making. And so that's a whole different approach, and it's a different process as well for the ethics boards of universities to consider. I gave a presentation on that to the ethics groups from a bunch of different universities, saying these are some of the problems, with Indigenous-led research that universities have because they're set up in a really different way. So that relationship making isn't just about working with Indigenous people, it's also looking at what is the relationship of research to different ways of approaching that, and what changes have to be made there. This again is part of the Anaukanwuch. It is for our people a really all-encompassing process. So part of it is ceremonial, which all the science people got to experience and engage in as a part of committing themselves to the work of this project. So from the Okanagan Syilx point of view, that is a necessary part in building the trust and in developing a pattern of being able to say, when you come to ceremony with us and engage in this depth of dialogue, then we know we can rely on you to keep your word on that in terms of how you work with us. And so that has really led, I think, to one of the really better outcomes, is that we don't have to continuously go back and explain trust, and you got to trust what they're doing. It's the consensus making process coupled with how we're engaging it from the Syilx perspective. I think that's really made a difference. And Lael already talked about this. So it is, I think, in terms of the way that it's modeled and constructed, I think it is going to be one of the clear, in my mind, a clear leading edge model that we can publish on, that we can, talk about, and that we can inform others about, that will impact how research is and should be done, and how researchers themselves with Indigenous people can build that community of research and knowledge making that we all need all together. If somebody had the answers already, things wouldn't be the way they are. So we all don't have answers, so the putting together of those answers, I think, rests on everyone, both sides of the table. What's really good about it is that the chiefs themselves are the overseers of the process, and we report to them. I'll be reporting to the Chiefs Executive Committee next week, I think. Just give them an outline of where we're at with the project, how many Indigenous masters and PhDs and undergrads we have, and how many non-Indigenous pieces of the work are falling into place. So we've been very successful so far. And so one of the outcomes of that is that it clarifies, the process itself clarifies how that reconciliation and the collaboration should look for this project. And I think that there's Lael, I think you're doing the presentation in there. You're doing your 3-minute spiel. Yeah. So it's face-to-face dialogue, and sometimes that's difficult for researchers too, because researchers are they need to be so isolated, as you all probably know, in terms of it's a lonely road, right, for the most case. And a lot of and especially in science, a lot of the kind of human interaction is something that's not really comfortable in that space. But we have made that space comfortable for both sides. And I think it has been. So that's what I have to offer you. I'll leave that one up. So I think we're ready for dialogue. Yeah, questions, dialogue, comments, whatever.